The content of this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional for any health concerns. Take care of yourself out there.
Welcome to Unravelling. This is a podcast that sees the world through the lens of mental health. I'm Mary Wilson, a journalist.
And I'm Kurt White, a social worker and psychotherapist.
And today we have our second interview from the Brattleboro Literary Festival back in October.
Yes, it's the second in a pairing of authors that had a panel discussion with one another, and we were so lucky to be able to interview them. Really enjoyed this author and getting to talk with her and reading her book. This is Anna Shechtman, who talks about her book, The Riddle of the Sphinx.
And Anna draws a lot of comparisons to Crosswords.
She sure does. She's actually a noted crossword creator who's published crosswords in many major publications, New York Times, and regularly writes them for The New Yorker. She is an assistant professor of literature and English at Cornell University, specializing in media studies and American literature. She's working on a two-volume history of media and data concepts in the United States, is doing some very interesting research. And here she's talking about the crosswords as a way of thinking about our struggle with the complexity and paradoxes in our life, the way that we put things into boxes and have to take them out of boxes to find substitutions for things, and found that as a kind of a metaphorical guide in her understanding of her own journey in recovery from eating disorders.
That's so interesting. I'm really looking forward to this interview. Hi, it's Mary cutting in to let you know that we'd like to hear from you. We've had so many interesting discussions on this podcast and so many guests who we've spoken to. And now it's your turn to add your voice to the mix. We'd love to hear any questions or feedback, comments about the topics we've covered.
Or new topics, things that you see in your own lives about where does a mental health lens intersect with the world from your point of view? Are there things you'd like for us to tackle or talk about, either in a big way or in a little bite-sized way on an upcoming episode? We hope that you'll give us a call, email us, send us a voice memo. We've got a phone number. That's 802-258-3763, 802-258-3763, or 258-3POD, or an email address, unravel@brattlebororetreat.org. We'll have those also in the show notes. Send us a voice memo, leave us a voice message, or just send us an old-fashioned email. We'd love to hear from you.
And now back to the episode.
Anna Shechtman, welcome to Unravelling. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you. It's really my pleasure.
So you talk about your own personal experience with anorexia and also as a crossword constructor. When did you start becoming a crossword constructor, and when did anorexia become an issue for you? And how have you seen them as related in your thinking and feeling and life?
Yeah. Almost to the day when I was 15, I stopped eating and I started writing crossword puzzles, and I knew that they were linked. And I wanted to better understand the connection because when I just said it out loud, it sounded maybe arbitrary or incidental and certainly just weird. It's not that I particularly liked writing crosswords in a way, and I certainly didn't like starving, but I was desperately looking for some sort of ego stability, right? And for reasons that I could go into and do go into the book, the idea of an anorexic and the idea of a crossword constructor seemed not only like, they actually seemed like compatible kind of identity containers. I imagine people might think, oh, she's smart, she's disciplined, she has a discipline, right? But also that she is, and this was a phrase that I'd read in my high school textbook, that she's perfectionistic. You know, if I become an anorexic, sort of actively and aspirationally become an anorexic, same with crossword constructor, that I will be understood as perfectionistic, was, in addition to being woefully myopic and self-destructive, was also just a misunderstanding of the very idea of perfectionism. I quite simply lopped off the second half of it in my mind and truly thought that the textbook was just saying if you clinically starve yourself, you will be perfect. And I think that there's, especially for women, a kind of sense that one way to be perfect is to be perfectionistic, and that including all the self-discipline and self-punishment that goes along with that. When I wrote a crossword puzzle, and I wrote them by hand in my graph paper notebook from my geometry class, I was really not thinking about the meanings of words. I was just trying to sort of tear words apart and build them back up until they were meaningful words again. And that process was very difficult, but it occupied a certain part of my brain that almost shut off all the other parts. When I was either trying to stave off the feelings of hunger that I was willfully repressing, or because I was in some sort of half measure of a recovery or painfully protracted failed recovery for about 6 years, if I had just eaten and felt full and uncomfortable, that process of just I'm going to only use this one part of my brain, totally useless in a way. It's actually, it's almost like spotting or something. Just focus on this one dot so the rest of the world goes away.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I heard you say in the lecture about the sort of connection of enjoyment to that, or actually the lack of enjoyment.
Yes, yeah.
And I found that very, very interesting, and wonder if you could speak about that.
Yeah. I think when we talk about anorexia and its connection to fat phobia, we tend to think of that in terms of social norms. Our culture has prejudice against fatness. I take the phobia part of it pretty literally, actually, because if I was willfully opting into anorexia, at a certain point, it did not feel like I had control anymore. One of the many paradoxes of this disease, right? It's all about control, and that at a certain point, as much as I wanted to be in recovery, that was not something that I was going to be able to do on my own through sheer willpower alone. I don't think that that's because I was addicted to dieting, although I understand why some people use that framework. I think it's because the phobia, the fear of not only gaining weight, but not being anorexic anymore, because it had provided this admittedly extremely precarious ballast for my identity. The fear that it wouldn't be there, who would I be without it? That I wouldn't be completely unlovable and undeserving, That fear was all-consuming and led to all sorts of rigidities that, to say that they interrupted or distorted my relationships with myself or with my loved ones or my work, basically anything I valued, that's an understatement. I mean, that's where the misery really set in. And I think also that sense that I know for a fact that I wasn't trying to starve myself to death. And I, at a certain point feel like I wanted to die because I did not see a life out without anorexia, and yet it was a miserable life. I also didn't feel like I understood it, and yet I self-identified as a smart person. And so that was really, really difficult. I developed countless theories as to why I was sick, and none of them were particularly satisfactory. Of course, a lot of that was relayed off of therapists, so there was a performative element to it too. But all of that was really misery-making. So all to say that there is a part of this book that is about that paradox of feeling like you strive for control and yet you've spun out of control. And
maybe things that are gratifying but not pleasurable, as
exactly.
compulsions often are.
Oh, that's such a brilliant way to phrase that. Yeah. Deeply gratifying because sort of appreciation for thinness is reinforced all the time. Also the desire to be good, and also the desire to be cause for concern. To be really rule-bound and also totally unruly. And that sense that you're disciplining something that is profoundly unruly, like the body of language, right? But also that you're disciplining it by bringing out all of its unruliness, by playing with it, by breaking all of its rules, but still then getting the right answer. There's yet another sort of way that I think the kinds of thinking that appeal to a crossword constructor and became ultimately symptomatic for me as an anorexic are related. And this is a sort of way a mode of thinking I developed while writing the book, which is linguists sometimes talk about certain ways of thinking about language as paradigmatic or syntactical, and those sound forbidding, but it's actually quite easy to grasp. So pronouns, he, her, she, him, those are paradigms. Those are, you can substitute them for each other and a sentence will still make sense. So she spoke, he spoke, those sentences are still legible. But the relation between he and spoke or she and spoke is a syntactical relation. So anorexics like to think in substitutions, and they like to think paradigmatically. Crossword constructors tend to do the same. I think that's the great pleasure of a crossword clue, is that however much misdirection there is, you'll still always get a perfect substitution. That need for a perfect substitution, though, can really ruin your day as an anorexic.
Probably as a crossword editor, too.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. For sure. One outcome is a little more trivial, but yes.
Yes, exactly. Yes. I mean, I wanted to get right into that, issue of language, actually, because you do so much with it. I mean, so much will only touch on some of it, but I was really captured by your description of crosswords as kind of a concretization and categorization of language itself, and the ways that this is all at once confining, a way it can be in a liminal space, the way it can be playful, the way it can be creative, and the way it can be actually quite subversive, or the opposite in a way. And I think it's an interesting thing to think of how is the language of the self operating, in anorexia, for example, or in society around the categories that we accept or don't accept and what we call health or not health or something like that.
Totally, yeah. I think the women in the book that I write about tend to divide into two camps. Don't worry, I'll complicate this. And largely because I really identify with both of them. But many of them have a very strong conservative impulse, and their relationship to language and to the crossword puzzle is that they want to demonstrate their tremendous fluency in sort of proper usage, proper grammar, the canon of Western knowledge. If we were to draw upon our stereotypes, which we do constantly anyway, they are grammarians, are librarians, custodians of language. And yet, it wouldn't be an overstatement to say that the language that they demonstrate such sort of pastoral and maybe sometimes punishing care over is it's not theirs, right? They're keeping care of it, but it is what we might call patriarchal language. These women would feel very strongly that he is the neutral pronoun, Then there's another strain of women in the book who are actively trying to manifest their feminist politics in language by fucking with it. That's what they want to do with language. They want to, they're subversive in language. So these are women like Ruth Hale, who she was the founder of the Amateur American Crossword Puzzle Association, but actually League. This was the time of leagues. So it's the 20s, the Amateur American Crossword Puzzle League, and also the Lucy Stone League, which the American Crossword Puzzle League codified the rules of a crossword puzzle. So she loves rules. It needs to be 180-degree symmetry, no words fewer than 2 letters, or fewer than 3 letters, rather, right? So she's developing all of these rules. Her other league that she's the president of is the Lucy Stone League. That is a league that was petitioning the State Department, petitioning banks to allow a woman to keep her own last name after she's married. So Ruth Hale is actually the very first woman in the country to have her own name on the deed to her house. She's subversive within rules, She really wants to abide by the rules, and she really wants her own damn name, But then you have someone all the way on the other end of this reductive spectrum, which is someone like Julia Penelope, who was, as she describes it, a cunning linguist. She was a woman who wrote crossword puzzles that she identified as lesbian separatist crossword puzzles. And they're incredible. They're these consciousness-raising puzzles, or she identified them as consciousness-raising puzzles. But you would not be able to solve them if your feminist consciousness hadn't already been raised. They're very niche. It's Lavender Blank, the group that disrupted the Now Convention. You'd really have to know the Lavender Menace to solve them. But she was doing them entirely in isolation because at that point, She'd moved to Texas away from New York. She had been a founder of the Lesbian History Archive in New York, taught some of the very first women's literature classes in this country, but had completely alienated herself from the women's movement and from the movement for lesbian rights, large part because she got into these very aggressive fights with people over language, over what words mean. Huge fight with Audre Lorde. Dumb idea, don't fight with Audre Lorde. Huge fight with Audre Lorde about whether the erotic could be reclaimed by feminists or whether basically it had too many connotations that were patriarchal. Lorde obviously thinks that erotic, there's a feminist politics to the idea of erotics, including just like feeling the sun on your back, right? If you know a little bit about the history of second wave feminism in this country, you won't be too surprised to learn that the term that really she ended up sticking to really rigidly in a way that was very divisive and wounding for her relationships in the community and quite hurtful to other people was the word woman. She was deeply transphobic. She believed that a woman was a certain thing and could not be anything else. Now, talk about paradigmatic thinking, right? Like, she is not thinking about how the word woman operates in the relationship to the rest of the culture and how she relates to trans women. This is just like, this word means this. They're perfect substitutes. End of story. Seriously stubborn, seriously ugly. And yet, I would never defend her on those terms. I will just say that there is something that I can only understand as symptomatic. She wasn't anorexic, but she did have a very disordered relationship to food. There is something that I understand how she could get herself into this kind of isolating and yet by her own terms idealistic position. There's one woman in the book named Ruth Von Full, also completely nuts. I say that with great affection, who wrote a haiku late in life. Briefly, she was a champion crossword puzzle solver in the 20s, cryptanalyst in the 40s, and then a self-taught Joyce scholar, well-published self-taught Joyce scholar in the 60s and 70s. And she wrote a haiku in the 70s that was published in Harper's, and it's like the perfect motif for all of these women and this relationship to language that is somehow, so I say, rule-based and subversive and overdetermines their identity in this way. And the haiku goes like this. What a paradox is an unbending person who cannot unbend. And that's why when I say I would never defend Julia Penelope or I would never pathologize her, or it's more complicated than that. And yet I understand her by way of that haiku. That idea that you can be so principled that you can wound yourself and your principles. You know, that's the paradox.
And I this might be a slightly unusual question, but I as a preamble to it, maybe I think it's sort of my opinion, I guess, that we're living in a moment that isn't all that curious about history. That there's a deep pull toward atavism on the one hand, which is really not the historical, and then a deep pull toward idealism or a kind of maybe perfectionism of the present moment that judges everything that happened yesterday as terrible and unthinkable in a way. And these are sort of I think then replicated in lots of ways, including some of our larger social dialogues. And I think they both cause problems for us, actually. And so one thing that was...
Amen. We're sitting with crosses all around us, but like seriously, amen to that. Yeah.
And one thing I just loved so much about the book is that you really take the history seriously on its own terms. I mean, I'm not afraid to sort of engage it on our terms also, breathe fresh life into it in that way. But I think, the way that you brought the particular struggles to life is something really special. And I'm curious about your relationship and thinking about how the historical maybe has given some flexibility in your own thinking about this.
Yes. Yeah. As an academic, I couldn't agree more that there's nothing of more practical use to the present than an understanding of history. But in the context of this book, there was serious catharsis in learning about these women historically and understanding both the particular inflections of their their relationship to their privilege, their relationship to their desire to be seen as smart, right? So great to sort of be like, what does it look like to be a woman who really wants to be seen as smart in 1924? But then what about a woman who really wants to be seen as smart in 1974? And then myself writing in 2024. And those kinds of creating those kinds of identifications without overestimating them, right? Mm-hmm. First of all, I grew up in a time when there was a epidemic of eating disorders. That's not to say that there was no anorexia nervosa or bulimia in the 1920s. There certainly was, but
they wanted to lock the bathrooms in high school cafeterias.
Right, exactly.
In many areas.
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
So there are obviously great cultural differences, and I have a lot more freedom professionally than any of these women had. But seeing certain shared limitations, and we're talking, for the most part, women, we have privileges of higher education, we are white, and we are all, so we have sort of as much freedom as women are going to have in our time. And yet we all found our way into this very punishing relationship with language and with our bodies and our relationship to being women, right? And that's all a function, I think, of our desire to be understood as smart, as strong, as ambitious in ways that were completely incompatible with the cultures we lived in. So seeing how those manifest themselves differently historically, and yet also saying like, wait a sec, I see you, Julia Pinello. I see you, Ruth Hale. Like I know how you got yourself into this position, but it's actually only through researching, reading, understanding the world you lived in that I can forge those identifications. That was just like a tremendous pleasure in writing the book.
Oh, yeah. And you get at that, I think, in the wonderful sentence, I paraphrase that in anorexia, the pathological is the personal is the political, which is wonderful, and I think that you're talking about that here, right? That these are not...
Yes, totally. I mean, that line comes out of a point when I was talking about before I went into treatment. And I should say I'm very lucky in many ways, but there is a quite high mortality rate for anorexia nervosa, and there are often times where I wonder, what separates me from someone in a stable recovery from someone who has not been in a stable recovery or who's not survived the disorder. And I know, and I don't say this lightly, like I know that there's a lot of luck that emerged from that, and I can put my finger on it, and it's because of the women that I was in treatment with. We were all really shared, really committed to not just our own recoveries, but each other's, which did not mean that it was uncomplicated or happy, but like we were ferociously committed to our recoveries and each other's well-beings. And it was really my first experience of something like a sort of sororal space or sisterhood. And my sister is my best friend in the world, but my eating disorder had completely disrupted our relationship. We were quite literally estranged from each other for many years. But being in treatment and eating 3 meals and 3 snacks a day, and I don't know, just having to sit in our bodies together all day, was a time for me of sort of feminist awakening, but it was really highlighted. I mean, I remember the first one, after a really difficult interaction, one of the women in the center gave me a hug, and it was the first hug I'd ever received from a woman who wasn't my mother in at least 6 years. I just was so isolated before treatment from other connections with women. And I remember having this thought of like, very self-conscious thought that I must seem so anti-feminist. Like, you must read the play I'm punishing my own body as a sort of universal punishment to all women's bodies. So that line of like, I wanted to tell them it's not personal, it's pathological, And then, of course, I have to step back. Like, the way they're perceiving me is not untrue either. So yes, maybe in the case of anorexia nervosa, the pathological is the personal, is the political.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm sometimes surprised that in the mental health field that the lack of curiosity there is about how things are influenced outside the sort of very rigid limitations of the sort of imagined mind or skull or the individual or something like that. That it is almost, these diagnostic categories are reified to the point of being almost, talk about rigid, right? It's very strange. And yet we change them all the time and then act like we didn't change them.
Yes, of course. And the fact that I was, and this was the word that was used to me, a pure anorexic, was obviously its own fuel for the disorder, right? That anorexia itself is the diagnostic category, but has all of these associations of purity that if even mental health care providers might tell you about or imply in talking about just how hard it is to treat you because you're really a pure anorexic. I guess I had been in individual therapy, outpatient, and when I first got to treatment, I was completely terrified of the other women and the idea that we would be living together and also doing group therapy. And it was double, triple-edged. I was terrified of them. Thought I was superior to them. My superiority complex had a lot to do with things, with that sort of conservative grammarian impulse of like, let me just tell you guys, I wrote a crossword puzzle in the New York Times. Like, they don't need to fucking know that, you know? Like, I had developed all sorts of ballasts that ends up being very precarious for my sense of self that I was just like not prepared to have knocked down, you know? And all of them, of course, had to get knocked down in the process of group therapy. And by group therapy, I don't just mean like sitting around in group talking, like just being with each other every day and committing to each other's well-being. And a lot of that, some of that will be like kind of explicitly political. Like we'll talk about things that have contributed, we know, to our eating disorder and be like kind of rage out about the culture together. But oftentimes it'll be just as political because we're like, you know, making eye contact when we know that someone's going through a really hard time at the meal, you know? And like, that's not political, or at least wasn't in this particular context.
I was really interested to read about the treatment parts of things. You know, as a therapist, I'm always sort of, I wonder, you know, we have our own, like we put it together, we hope people have a good experience, but it's complicated even to evaluate it. How, you know, what are our metrics, what do we do? But one of my main subspecialty areas as a therapist is as a group therapist. And so when you start talking about the power of this group and as a sort of feminist experience also, an actualization in a way, maybe of an intellectualized feminist experience. It was very powerful to me. And I think it was S.R. Slavson, who in the 1950s founded the American Group Psychotherapy Association, who once said, it's old, kind of funny old language, but he said, by the group they have been broken, and by the group they shall be healed. And I thought, that's actually kind of weirdly progressive for the 50s. Like,
yeah,
you understood that there was something actually, that the pathology wasn't individual, and so you needed something in a group to help, actually.
Yeah. I mean, it took, and I was there for 6 months, and I would say it took at least 6 weeks, maybe 2 months, to even really allow myself to understand that I was there in the group, you know, that like I wasn't just there for my treatment and was sort of like looking forward to my meetings with the therapist and my meetings with the nutritionist, and otherwise was just sort of like reading because I had to gain weight, which meant sitting there until my next meal or my next meeting with a therapist and nutritionist. And it was in a group therapy meeting where this one in particular, someone told me that it hurt her feelings. I mean, thank fucking God she told me I had hurt her feelings, because I truly would have never known. When I walked in, I was like, this is going to work for me, because I had wanted to be recovered for a long time. Of course, I also was terrified of gaining weight and wanted nothing less than to be recovered, right? I mean, like, would have done it presumably, and if I could have, but I was like, okay, one and done. We're beating this thing. Completely oblivious to the fact that most of the women in this treatment center, this is not their first time. Have now at this point literally listened to people talk about like this being their 6th time in a treatment. And here I am still being like, one and done, guys. You know, and there are certain times you can be like, well, I was malnourished and cognitively impaired. And it's like, nope, you were an asshole. You know, like that.
We sometimes say it's not that people talk about their problems in group, it's that they are their problems in group.
Completely. But like, thank God that she just said to me, like, that really hurt my feelings. It's not that like it derailed group and it became the topic of the group. It's just that it like very effectively derailed and rooted my own treatment, you know? And this treatment center I went to, it's called Avalon Hills. They have a couple of different things that they did that I think set me up for a strong recovery. against many odds. The biggest one is insurance companies. So seriously expensive treatment center. They have a full-time team of 3 different women whose full-time job is to deal with insurance companies. And even still, my dad's an attorney, and we ended up appealing their decision that said when I'm at 90% of my so-called healthy weight, as determined by, I think, body mass indexes, which is like, well,
problematic. Yeah.
it's not that reliable.
Yeah.
In fact, it's debunked.
Yep.
They'll stop paying, unless you really, it's a complete failure in all your appeals, or your family is willing and able to pay out of pocket. They don't advise that you're released until you've not only gained the weight that their medical team has determined is necessary for you, but you're still there for another 3 or 4 months. Yeah. You're just there to learn how to exist in a satiated body, and then also to learn what it's like to feel hungry and respond to it, feel full and stop. That is the work that still needs to be done and should still be paid for by, or at least was I can't imagine if I had been sent out. There's just no way I would have known what to do with that.
Yeah, I appreciated that a lot too. I think that's actually quite unusual. Yeah. I mean, that people actually get to be in a place like that for the time that they really would need it. And
yeah.
I think the sort of standards around that have been chipped away at for largely financial reasons for decades. And it's a real unfortunate thing.
Yeah. And it's also, it's just betrays a total misunderstanding of eating disorders to assume that someone is healed when they're at a certain weight. That's just not how it works. But that is how insurance companies work.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask also about feminism as a sort of through line for you in your thinking about eating disorders. And if you could take us into that a little bit, which permeates so much of what we've talked about.
Yeah. Eating disorders affect every demographic at the same rate. That's the part that is always surprising to me. And especially adolescents at the same rate. Male, female, trans, non-binary. It was actually very perversely motivating and ultimately very detrimental to myself that I had an image of a sort of hysterical rich white girl in my mind when I was that's who I want to be. Because it's a sensationalized image, and I was drawn to her, right? Which only betrays the stony limits of my own teenage imagination and a ton of kind of internalized misogyny and frankly racism. That I was this is the feminine ideal. I can get there. And yeah, she's a little fucked up, So having so stipulated that this particular version of white middle class, white rich woman anorexic is what most people think of still in their minds, and has this outsized place in the anorexic imaginary or in our culture around weight and women. One thing to just say is that the same anorexic woman who we imagine when we think of eating disorders often, she's also been this contested subject. Maybe she's actually a feminist because she's staging an anti-patriarchal protest because she refuses to allow her body to be sexualized and when she stops menstruating, then she's actually undermining the very terms by which she would be valued under patriarchy. And it's well, that all sounds kind of cool, but not super true to my experience. Or alternatively, she is this completely anti-feminist figure who wants to dominate and beat all other women by the very terms that women are so oppressed and assessed under patriarchy, their weight. So she's the saint or the sinner. Neither is particularly true to my experience, which isn't to say that competition and comparing, I don't have a clear sense of whether the anorexic is a feminist figure or an anti-feminist figure. I think that you can be a feminist anorexic politically. You can have shared political values and ideals with other anorexics or non-anorexics that we all want equal rights for women. But there is a certain like feminist ethics of just like how to care for other women that I only was able to learn once I was at like a medically healthy weight and sustaining my own recovery.
Mm-hmm. And maybe what would you want to say to somebody who's maybe still struggling with this, maybe visibly or invisibly, or
yeah. This is really corny, but I just got kind of sentimental thinking about this, that I would just actually want to like acknowledge how hard they're working to be so many things that are actually in direct conflict with each other, and like acknowledge that work and like promise them actually that those demands, those conflicting ideals are always going to be there, right now at least, but that they don't actually have to do that as much work as they're doing. And like recovery itself is extremely hard work, but it is nothing like being in an active eating disorder, that trying to be a good daughter, be a good sister, be a good student, and be actively underweight or be unable to feed yourself. Like, it's just hard. And harder still when you have a lot of demands from care providers who are like, come to this appointment, check in, we'll do this way. And like, that's work, being a patient. And so when I hear stories of people who are like, or just thinking of myself, like just did not see a way out of that much work, wished there was just some sort of like pill I could take that would make it so that I was like, never gained weight, but never lost weight, just like didn't have to deal with food, didn't have to deal with my body. Like, that doesn't exist. But like, that is actually, there is a relief from the amount of work you're doing in recovery, and a lot of that's because there's not the work of hiding too. So acknowledge that it's a lot of work.
Thank you, and thank you for talking with me too.
Yeah, of course, it's my pleasure.
And I again just want to recommend the book, The Riddle of the Sphinx: Inheriting the Feminist History of the Crossword Puzzle, which is just an absolute marvelous read, and I hope people check it out.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Anna Shechtman for her generosity in sharing her experience, her thoughts and feelings, and her wide-ranging studies of history and culture in this arena. Joining me back again to talk about it is Mary. Hi, Mary.
Hi. Yeah, it was such an interesting conversation, so wide-reaching, and she really touched upon the complexities of eating disorders and her own experience.
Yes, I really appreciate that she, puts so much in a historical and cultural context. I mean, I think we've said before on the podcast that sometimes there's an impulse in the mental health world to do kind of the opposite, to sort of hone in very deeply into the individual, the internal world. But actually, most of what's really interesting from a mental health perspective, it seems to me, is at this intersection of the individual and cultural, communal, social sort of world.
Yeah, and she even emphasized the group dynamics in treatment and how that was so helpful for her to hear from other people experiencing eating disorders.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I think the sort of being a part of a group, as well as the sort of practicalities of the actual interactions in that group, is something that I think is very, very powerful for a lot of folks, actually.
Yeah, and really understanding the cultural history of certain terms, similar to what Emmeline Klein said about BMI, how so much of the language we use, the terminology, was created by a small group of white men.
Yeah, and I think, this thread of the history of feminism in particular as having a relationship to eating and eating disorders, as well as crossword puzzles, is very interesting, I think, as a kind of an antidote to the world that has been created largely by a fairly narrow group of privileged men over time to live in, but everyone else has to also live there. It's a real problem that shows up in a lot of different ways.
And of course, we want to thank both of these amazing authors for their books and for their time in speaking with us. We'll put the links in our show notes.
Unravelling is brought to you by Brattleboro Retreat and is produced by Charts and Leisure.
Find us on social media by searching Brattleboro Retreat. Brattleboro Retreat is committed to exploring diverse perspectives on mental health. While we invite hosts and guests to share their insights, the views expressed are their own and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of the hospital or its staff.